And when the State of Israel was established 70 years ago, there was a huge amount of immigration into the country. Now, everybody talks about the Palestinian refugees, about 700,000 Arabs who, for all kinds of reasons, left Israel. But nobody mentions that at the same time, 1 million Jews who lived in Arab countries were thrown out and came to Israel. Now, many people who came to Israel did not come out of Zionist ideology. Many of them came because they had to leave the country they were living in, and there was no place else to go. Some of them, if they could have gotten an immigrant visa to the United States, would have preferred going to the United States. But in many cases, there was no opportunity, and so people came to Israel. As I said, 1 million Jews from the Arab countries who were thrown out, a large number of people who had survived the Holocaust, people for all kinds of reasons came. And in the beginning, the first Prime Minister, Mr. Ben-Gurion, said, if America is a melting pot, we will be a pressure cooker. In one generation, everybody will be Israeli. They will forget that they came from Poland or from Romania or from Morocco or from Egypt. In one generation, everybody will be Israeli. And he used an example. He said, in the Bible, the children of Israel, when they left Egypt, had to wander in the desert for 40 years until the generation that knew slavery died and a new generation would come. The same thing will be here. The parents will die and the children will be Israeli. Did it work? No. For the same reason it didn't work in the United States. People do not change their way of life, their norms, so easily. It takes time. Now, in the United States and in Israel today, we are talking about what we call cultural pluralism, meaning that the society has more than one culture. You can be Chinese American, Greek American, Russian American, Italian American, Afro American. In other words, you keep part of your own culture and you absorb part of the new culture and you also influence the new culture. And so we talk about cultural pluralism. Israel has also reached the same conclusion. You can be Moroccan Israeli, you can be Russian Israeli, you can be Italian Israeli, Egyptian Israeli. In other words, you keep part of your own culture, of the culture that you grew up with, and you absorb the new culture. And it influences one another. There is cross-fertilization between the original culture and the new culture. Now, this does not take place in one generation. This takes time. If we look at the Israeli society today, Israel is now much more open to the idea of cultural pluralism. In the early days of the state, everybody was supposed to be Israeli. But what is Israeli? What do we mean by Israeli? Kibbutz? Who knows? In other words, the Israeli culture is still being developed. We have not reached a stage where we can say, this is Israeli culture. And so as a result, gradually, people have begun making change. And today, for example, there are many activities that 40 years ago would not happen. In other words, there are ethnic holidays that take place in the country, where people from Morocco have their own celebration, where people from Egypt have their own celebration. And this is accepted, while it was once not accepted. And so we see that the concept of cultural pluralism is something that is developing in this country. Now, many of your own, we talked about the fact that people leave villages to come to the big city. And when they come to the big city, in many cases it's overwhelming. In the village, everybody knew one another, for good and bad. Everybody knew exactly what was going on in their neighbor. When they come to the big city, Shanghai, Beijing, they're lost. Because all of a sudden, there is no back of people who can know them and can help them. They have to adjust to a new society, and it is a new society. It's a different society. People behave differently in the big city than they do in the village. Now we also see that when people move to a new society, whether it's a different country or a city, changes take place in the family. We have found, for example, that children pick up a new language quicker than their parents. And so they become the interpreter between their parents and the society. If a letter comes from school, or if they've got to go to an interview, you'll have a 10, 11, 12-year-old child coming to translate. Now what does that mean as far as the parent? In the old country, the parent was the authority. In the village, the parent was the authority. All of a sudden, the child is the one who has a lot more responsibility, who has a lot more to do, and it begins to change what is taking place in the family. Because all of a sudden, the father or the mother are not the head of the family as they used to be, but in the new society, they have to learn to adjust to a new way of life and relationship within the children. And this at times can lead to problems and to difficulties. Now, what does unite the society in Israel? There are a number of things. First of all, I said that theoretically, most of the immigrants coming to Israel are Jewish people. Who is a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew? Is it a religion? Many of the Jewish people are not in the least bit religious. Is it a way of life? The way of life differs. What we talk about peoplehood, common history, common background, which unites the people coming to the country. There are other definitions which we won't go into at the moment. Now, when people come to this new society, to the new country, as I said, it takes a long time to change. There are certain elements in the Israeli society which help bring about the change. Army service. As you know, every male in Israel, theoretically, from the age of 18 to 21 serves in the army. Every female from the age of 18 to 20 serves in the army. There are exceptions. If somebody is studying for a rabbinical degree, unfortunately, they are not drafted into the army. In many cases, obviously, if a woman is married or has a child, she doesn't go into the army. But the army is a place where people meet from the different background and work together and get to know one another. So the army is one way of bridging the gaps within the different groups. And the school system in Israel is also built, theoretically, around the idea of integration, of people from different backgrounds working together. Now, this does not always work out in reality, because the school system in Israel, we're not going to go into all the details, is set up on a political and religious background where you have separate school systems. But the school system is one way of trying to integrate into the society. In the past 20 years, Israel has absorbed 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union. And coming to Israel has led to many very interesting problems and many very interesting activities. Many of the people who came to Israel from the former Soviet Union brought with them skills that were highly necessary for the state of Israel. Whether it was in science or medicine or music or culture, many of them have developed a very important part of the society. But for many people, it's been very difficult. For example, in order to be a doctor in Israel, you have to, if you studied abroad, you have to pass an examination. Many of the people who came from the Soviet Union, medicine, particularly in rural areas, was years behind Western medicine. And so somebody comes to Israel and they are told you've got to pass an examination, you've got to go back to learn. The person said, but I was the head of the department of orthopedics in the Kazakhstan school for the past 50 years. Say, we're sorry, that's not Western medicine. You've got to go back and learn new types of medicine, new medication, which didn't exist. By the way, a lot of what went on had to do with politics. For example, brief example, in the 1950s, there was an epidemic of polio all over the world. 1952, a vaccine came out, which was used all over the world, except for the Soviet Union. Why? Because the vaccine was made by an American, and therefore it was a bourgeois nationalist vaccine. It took the Soviet Union another 10 years to develop their own vaccine. In the meantime, children got polio that in the Western world or China you didn't see anymore. But this was politics. So people coming to the new society have to learn a new way of behavior. One other example. In the former Soviet Union, you went 10 years to what was called school. Then you went to something called a technicum. Technicum was 3 years, and then you were an engineer. The Western world, you went 12 years to school, and another 3 or 4 years. And so somebody would come and say, I'm an engineer. The answer was that in the Western world, you're a technician, you're not an engineer. And so people had to learn a new status, a new way of life. And this made things at least a bit difficult. This shows us some of the problems moving from one society to another, from one culture to another. The idea of cultural pluralism is something which is very central today in immigration studies. Those of you who are following the news know the huge problems facing parts of Europe due to an influx of immigrants, many of them illegal immigrants who are coming primarily from Africa, from Syria, refugees from Afghanistan, and the difficulties the countries have in absorbing or accepting these populations. So immigration is something which is still going on all over the world. We are seeing, as I said, that the theory of push and pull is still something very, very central. People leave the society that they're living in because they are looking for a better way of life. And that better way of life usually means moving to a new country. Okay, that was a very brief presentation about cultural pluralism in Israel. It's something which is theoretically comparatively new. The country is 70 years old. When we sociologically look, 70 years is nothing. It's a very short period of time. And so we have to take a look at other countries that have absorbed immigration. United States, Australia, by the way, Canada. We see very similar activities. And just as an aside, Australia for years was talking about everybody being Australian. And they also had a policy, what they called White Australia. They did not let anyone in who was not European. But today they have changed as well. And you can be Chinese Australian and Greek Australian and Russian Australian. So they also have changed to the idea of cultural. Okay, I hope this gives you some picture. Thank you very much.